Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So the reading for today is taken from Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47. Here's what it says. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe, and many wonders and signs were being performed through the apostles. Now all the believers were together and held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple and broke their bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favor of all the people. Every day the Lord added to their number those who were being saved. May God bless us all in the reading for this morning.
Good morning, church. Nice to see everybody here this morning. I wanted to start out with sharing some results from a really amazing survey that I came across, and I've shared some of these results with you guys before, so maybe they're familiar to you. I'm not sure, but this has got to be one of my favorite surveys that I've ever seen, favorite studies that I've ever seen, and it was published by Harvard. It was done by the Harvard School. My clicker's not working. I'm sorry. Maybe I need somebody to. I have it here. Hopefully I can share it with you. It was working before worship. I tested it. 1 second. Sorry, guys. Try this again. Okay. There we go. Keeping you in suspense here. All right. We've got Harvard study on the board. So Harvard began this study, get this, way back in 1938. 1938, they started doing this study, and so it's been handed down through multiple generations, but for 86 years, they've been following a group of people, 724 people. They've been tracking them through their life, and the goal of the study is sort of the golden question, right, that everybody wants to know. It's this. What makes for a long and happy life? That's what they're trying to find out. And so they've been tracking these 724 people that they started with. They're not all alive anymore, but they've been tracking them and trying to find out what the answer to that question is. Now, the really impressive part of the study, at least in my opinion, is in what is not found to be the answer to this question, right? You might expect, well, it's got to be money, right? If everybody has money, they're happy. It must be a career. You've got a successful career. Maybe it's, having all the stuff, all the toys, or maybe it's diet and exercise. That's the answer. But really, it's none of that, which is really incredible, I think. What they found as the most important factor in the answer to this question is positive relationships. Positive relationships was the single most important factor in determining whether or not somebody had a long and happy life. And it wasn't just about being, happy. The people who had positive relationships were generally healthier, and they actually lived longer than those who did not. It's amazing, right? So there were sort of two paths that people took. One group of people, you could say, if we look at it very roughly, one group of people went on to be doctors, lawyers, run successful businesses, have successful families, things like that. And another path sort of led in the other direction. Some of the people became schizophrenics, alcoholics, sort of a very dark path to go down, right? And the thing that really struck me from this study is that, both of these groups, both of those paths, people on them, they lived in cities, they were with people. They went to the grocery store. They were surrounded by people. They maybe even were a part of a church community. They had people around them all the time, but something was missing because they were still, in some ways, alone, right? They didn't have those healthy relationships. And the difference is that the more successful people had this healthy community, whereas the other people were sort of alone in a crowd. We hear that term sometimes, right? Of being alone in the crowd. We know what that's like. We know what situations like this are like, right? You've seen this before. Maybe you've been a part of it. And I was thinking, you know what? Maybe that's a new thing. But then I found this picture here, and it's really not a new thing at all. You know, we've just kind of changed what we're looking at. But it's not a technology thing as much as it is like a human thing. It's a human thing for us to be in. We have to make a choice in our lives. Are we going to choose to invest in a community, or are we not? Because if we don't, it's according to this study, it's not going to go well for us. But if we do, you know, we'll live long and happy lives, which is great, but we're not really here for that specifically this morning. We're here to talk about learning to be like Jesus, right? Spiritual growth is what we're talking about this year, and this month we're focused on the things that we need, the essential elements that we need in our lives to grow spiritually. And so today, that's what we're going to talk about is the importance of a community. A community, and I wrote out the title a little bit strange, but I wanted to highlight that idea, right? This putting yourself in community, making the choice to be the community. You know, the Harvard study, it's really amazing. I think it's an interesting study, but for us, for those of us who are Christians, we got to kind of say, like, we don't really need that study, right? Because in some ways, we already know that community is important. I mean, God told us this long ago. God made us for community. In Genesis 2:18, we read about that, right? He said, "It is not good for the man to be alone." It's like the second chapter of the Bible, right? Off the beginning, we know that we need community. But what is community really? Right? Like, we can be alone in a crowd. So if that doesn't work, then what is it actually at the root that is a community? What makes a community? So I want to start by talking about that this morning. Let's actually get our heads around what that means. And then also the how question, you know, how can we be a part of it? How can we contribute to that so that we are a community in this group here? And I think the best thing that we can do is to learn from the example that Christian just read for us. It's from Acts 2, the early church community and what they had going on. So let's dive into this. Talk about the what question first. What is community really? I mean, is it this? Like, is it living next to people? Does that make a community? I mean, we talk about it like that sometimes, right? Like, we live in a certain community. Or maybe it's like being in the same room. You know, maybe you go to school, or like we're sitting in a church building together in close proximity right now. Does that make a community? I mean, we talk about it like that sometimes too, right? Maybe it's sharing an experience online. Apparently TikTok has lots of communities, right? We talk about that too, the idea of people being together in community online, but does that really make a community? And this example, I actually took this picture. It's just down the road from our house in Winnipeg. It's a community playground. At least that's what it said on the sign when I walked in. But are you noticing something that's wrong with this community? I mean, I was there for like 10 minutes sitting on the bench. I saw 0 people. Nobody was there. And I think in some ways it kind of struck me, you know, like this playground was sort of a metaphor for what can happen in our lives and even in the church, I think, too. We can have all the infrastructure we want, right? We can have a beautiful building. We can have services. We can have programs. We can have staff and everything, all the books and everything. We can have all the infrastructure, but we can still have no community. And I hope that kind of strikes us this morning, because we need to understand what community really is if we want to shoot for it. And my point, by the way, is not that those things are wrong, you know, that we shouldn't have a building and those kinds of things, but I want to make sure we don't get it backwards, because I think sometimes we do. You know, our community, our sense of community may inspire us to pursue some of those things, the building, the staff, these things, the programs, but these are not the things that will guarantee that we build a community. No more than putting a play structure in a park would guarantee that a community will be built around it. Right? We need to have things in the right order. The church community, this is the point I really want us to get this morning. If you don't remember anything else, the church community is who we are, right? It's not what we attend or where we go or what we do even. It's who we are, and we have to see it that way. We have to see the you in community. So I have a question for you. Do you feel like you're a part of this church community? I mean, deep down, at a gut level, are you a part of a community right now? Or are you together alone? Because we need to figure out what the community is and pursue a real community. And Acts 2:42 is great because it shows us sort of, I think, the engine, I would say, that built the community in the early church. It was made up of four things. You can kind of pick them out here on the screen. But they shared the teachings of Jesus that were delivered by the apostles, right? That was a core tenet of their community. It also says that they shared everything else too. They shared their faith together. They shared life together. They shared resources together. They ate together, especially the Lord's Supper. And they prayed together, which I want to kind of circle back to later on. But look at this list, right? Or look at this verse here. And notice maybe the thing that's striking is what it doesn't say. You know, it doesn't say they had this great community because they built a building, they hired a preacher, they created a good children's program, great song leading. And by the way, you know, I'm not saying that we shouldn't pursue those things or that they didn't have any of those things. But I'm just pointing out that was not what God chose to preserve in His Word as what was important and what built their community. It was these things here. The community was built because of the fact that they dwelled together on Jesus' teachings. The community was built because they were invested in each other. And literally, I mean, look at what it says here in verse 44 and 45. It says, the believers were together and they held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all, any who had need. So we see this sort of investment in one another happening. You know, they knew each other, which was a requirement of this investment that they were making, right? They had to know the highs and lows of one another. They need to know when there's a problem because obviously they needed to know each other if they were going to give their stuff and help those who had need. They were willing to sacrifice for one another. This was what was building their community. It says that they broke bread together back in verse 42. You know, and this was sort of a fellowship meal, a sharing in common of what they held in common, their faith certainly, and often this would include, you know, participating in the Lord's Supper together. And finally, we see their prayer. You know, they were praying together all the time. This community was a community of prayer. And these were the things that sort of built the community. And it says in verse 47 that it had this incredible effect in that it was attractive. You know, people were coming into this community every day. There was something going on in the church that drew people in. Amazing. And verse 47 shows that. And it says, and I wanted to point these things out, you know, those four things, not as sort of like a formula, you know, X plus Y plus Z equals community. I don't think that was really it. It was more of a way of life that I think we're trying to highlight here. It's a way of life for people who are committed to each other. Right? This is what it looks like when we're committed to one another and committed to following Jesus together. It doesn't happen by accident. It can only happen when we make that choice to identify in a community. And when the community becomes who you are, not just what you do or where you attend or where you go. You know, for the early church, their idea of community, I don't think it revolved around a particular meeting time. I don't think it revolved around a particular place that they went to. The community was just who they were. The you was in community for them. This is what we all need to build a community as well. This idea of seeing ourselves as the community. But the question is, you know, how do we create it? How do we create it? So that's what I want to kind of focus on here for the rest of our time today. And I think we start to see the answer to this question in something that I sort of breezed past in verse 42. If we go back there, it says that they devoted themselves. They devoted themselves. And I think this might be the best way to describe what needs to happen in all of our lives if we want to see this community form in our midst. Here's a question for you to reflect on personally. Are you devoted to this community? And I don't mean like, are you devoted to a calendar and attending a certain list of events? I don't mean, are you devoted to the pew chair that you're sitting in right now? I mean the people around you. Are you devoted to them? When someone is in need, does that affect you? Are your brothers and sisters on your mind through the week? Are you connecting with them? Do you sacrifice for their needs? Are you devoted? For the early church, their devotion was evident, I think, and maybe one way of describing it is that it affected their head, their heart, and their hands. And so I wanted to sort of lay it out like that for us this morning. I hope it's helpful. The head being like what they understood to be true, the heart being how it affected them and how they were convicted by the truth that they believed, and then the hands, obviously, the idea of what they did because of those things. And so I wanted to sort of highlight those now as we go through this together. So for the head part, we need to understand some things if we want to build this community. And again, it's about the title, right? It's seeing you in the community. It's understanding what it means to be part of the church family. We need to see the community as our identity. The church is who we are, not what we attend or where we go. We should think about church in the same way that we think about a healthy family. I hope you have an example of a healthy family in your life. And maybe if it's not your own family, we've witnessed someone around us who's in a healthy family situation. You would never hear somebody say, "Oh, I have to go to family tonight." Right? You would never hear that. That's just a weird thing to say. We don't go to family, right? We are family. We are the family. We share things in common with each other if we're in a healthy family. What happens to one member of the family affects everybody in the family. I hope you have a picture of that from your life. But even if you don't, we have the picture of it from Acts, and we see that happening. And in the same way, we don't go to church. I say that all the time. I know I've heard people say that all the time, but it really doesn't make any sense. We don't go to church and leave like it's some external thing to us that we can kind of go to and leave from and pick up again later. It doesn't really work like that, right? That's not how the Bible describes the church community. It doesn't start and stop with an opening and closing prayer. It doesn't end when a Bible study concludes. Right? Look at what it says here in Acts 2:42-46. It says, "Now all the believers were together, and they held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all as any had need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple, and they broke bread from house to house. They ate their food with joyful and sincere hearts." The early church went to temple together. They hung out together in each other's homes. They ate together. They shared their stuff. This wasn't a community that revolved around a calendar of events. It wasn't a community that revolved around a particular meeting time once a week. It revolved around their devotion to one another. It says that they were devoted to meeting together. And this is really the part that I want us to understand today, this devotion part. And I think it really leads us into the next part of this, the fact that we have to have our heart in it. We have to have our heart in the community. A building full of people or a bunch of names on a membership list does not equal community, not necessarily, right? Because we can have those things and have no community. Think about this. Maybe, another thing I hope you had a friends group growing up at school. Lots of fun, right? Or if you weren't a part of a public school, I hope you know what that's like, maybe from friends in the community that you grew up with or something like that. You know what it's like when you get really close with people around you. And so for instance, maybe from the school group that you had growing up, you first met them when you just showed up in a room together. You sat in class together, you sat with them every day, and you saw the same familiar faces all the time. But that really didn't make the community, did it? I mean, that group that you were so close with didn't come because you just sat in a classroom with them every day. The community began when you started getting close. When you hung out after school or on the weekends or between classes, when you started having sleepovers, when you phoned each other, when you went to birthday parties together, when you started talking together about important things in your life, maybe how things are going at home or a problem in your family or how your vacation was. When you start getting close like that, that's when a true community begins to form. Just being in the same room does not make a community. We have to make that heart investment in one another. And it's the same thing in the church. Being together at meeting times is great. And I wouldn't trade that for anything, but that is not necessarily going to form a community. It happens when we truly do what it's saying here, when we share the things that we have in common. And that can look like a lot of different things. And that's what we see from the early church. That they shared their resources. It says that they shared their time. They spent time together. They shared their food. They shared their homes. Right? They did all of these things together. But most importantly, and maybe most generally speaking, they shared themselves with each other. That's what created the community. So here's a question for you. Another question. What's going to happen in your life this week when you leave here this morning? When you go back to your regular week. What's going to happen when this meeting is over this morning? Will you and will I choose to put the you in community this week? I want to show you this picture. It's really zoomed in. I apologize for that. But this is a picture of a car bumper, right? And it's a good one because it has that awesome hook on there. Those are important. Has anybody ever gone into the ditch? I mean, we live in Winnipeg here, so that happens a lot. There's a lot of ice and snow in the winter. Ever been in the ditch and needed to be pulled out? I mean, that's a bad situation to be in, but hopefully you have a hook like this. Have you ever seen this? So maybe you've seen it online. I've definitely seen some funny videos online where somebody, is stuck somewhere and someone else is trying to pull them out, and they take the tow hook and they hook it on like the plastic part of the bumper. Have you seen that? And then, they try to pull them out, but of course the whole bumper just flies off the car and nothing really happens. They're still stuck in the ditch. I think that's a great metaphor for what can happen in the church as well, right? Unless you're connected, in terms of pulling a car out of the ditch, you have to be on that hook because that hook is connected to the frame, right? The internal frame of the car, the part that makes it strong. And unless you connect to that when you're pulling the car out of the ditch, it's not going anywhere. You're not going to be able to do anything for the other person. And it's really the same in the church. If we're only connected on a surface level, we can't do much for each other. And we're certainly not going to create a community in our midst. I got another question for you. Lots of questions this morning. Is there anyone in this church community that really knows you? And someone who's connected to you below just the surface level? Think about that question. That's so important because we need that. Somebody needs to be connected to you, at least one person. Because if not, then how are we going to do this? Like, look at what James 5:16 says. It says, "Therefore confess your sins to each other and pray for each other so that you will be healed." How are we going to accomplish this? How are we going to obey this command unless we know each other beyond a surface level? Or how about this one? Galatians 6:2, it says, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." A question, how are we going to do this if we don't know each other beyond a surface level? We're not going to. And we're not going to create a community unless we do. We must share our very selves. We have to put the you in community if we want to develop and grow this community. This is the example we see in the early church, right? We need to see ourselves as connected to the people around us, not just the routines that we go through together, not just the meeting times, not just the events. And again, I'm not saying that those things are not important. They are important. But we have to get things in the right order, because if we're only committed to the meeting times and the programs, we can still end up with no community. But if we're committed to the people first, as we are to God, then we're also by default going to commit ourselves to the things that we do together. We have to have the first things first. And so I just want us to think about this. Don't just be with the people, love the people. Love the people, because love is where it's at. That love is what's going to generate a community among us. And that kind of leads us to the last point here, the hands, the things that we do together. In the Church of Christ, we put a lot of emphasis on trying to be like the early church that we read about in the book of Acts. And overall, that's really good, I think. That's a really good posture to take. But there's something maybe not right about that. It's a good thing to try to be like the early church, but if looking like the early church becomes our main focus, we're going to miss the mark on something that's even more important. And maybe this is obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. Have you ever considered this? Have you ever considered that the early church wasn't trying to be like the early church? The early church wasn't trying to be like the early church. They were trying to be like Jesus, right? That was the most important thing. And that's where we truly need to imitate as well. And so what did that mean for them? What did that mean for the early church? Well, it meant things like this. It meant what Jesus told them to do. In John 13:34-35, it says, "A new command I give you." This is the words of Jesus. "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." It was about love. Why did they build that community? Well, it's because they were trying to do this. They were trying to be like Jesus. They were trying to love each other. And then John 15, later on in the same sort of scene, in the last moments of Jesus' life before he was crucified, he says this, "My command is this, love each other," and he puts like a modifier on it, "love each other as I have loved you." That's the way that they were supposed to love each other. And as they tried to do that, this is where the community came from, right? As I have loved you. This, more than anything else, built their community. And I think this is why we see these commands in Scripture. Like, for instance, in Romans 12:10, we see this very thing commanded of us. Paul, writing to the Roman church, said, "Be devoted to one another in love." In love. Honor one another above yourselves. So this is it. This is the root of building a community, being devoted to one another in love. And we sometimes have to kind of define what love means, because it gets sort of thrown around in a lot of different ways in our current culture and in our language. But love, they would have understood, if we go back to the previous verse, this is what they would have understood love to mean. And what the example that Jesus set for them, that was love. It was a self-sacrificing decision to do what is best for others around you. This is love, right? It wasn't necessarily a warm feeling towards each other, although that was probably involved in it. But at the core, it was a decision to do what was best for your brothers and sisters, even if it comes at a personal cost. And so in practical terms, that it looked like this. It looked like what we've been talking about this morning. Growing together in the teachings of Jesus. Sharing with each other, even if it means sacrificing what you have. Eating together, which we love doing, right? But it was more than just eating food for them, right? Especially in this culture and in this time. If you shared a meal with someone, it meant this sense of unity and trust that you're extending to someone else, a fellowship, a sharing in common. And also it looked like praying with each other. And I really want to end off on this because I think this is so critical and so important. Are we a community of prayer? Do we pray with one another in this community beyond just what we do here in Sunday morning? And I'm not knocking what we do on Sunday morning, but I'm asking, are we a community of prayer? Are we a community that prays through the week together? Do we know each other well enough that we can pray together? Do we know what's going on in each other's lives well enough that we can pray for one another? Are we a community of prayer beyond Sunday morning? This is important because for the early church, it connected them to each other. It connected them as a unit to God, and it helped to build their community. Brothers and sisters, we need to be a community that prays just beyond what happens here in a worship service. Okay, well, I hope that's helpful. The message today is very simple. The church community is who we are, not what we attend or where we go or what we do. And so I hope for you that's inspiring some kind of next step. What is your next step from this? Is it learning to invest more in the community? Is it stepping up to serve in a particular area? Is it opening yourself up to your brothers and sisters so that people have an opportunity to see your burdens, your sins, and maybe so that you have an opportunity to bear theirs as well? Maybe it's learning to pray with one another. Maybe it's shifting your focus so that instead of thinking about attending events and programs, first and foremost, we're thinking about the people and being devoted to them as we are devoted to God. Maybe it's simply to join this community. If you have not decided to make Jesus your Lord and Savior, to be baptized into Him, to follow Him, maybe this is your step, to join the community. Maybe it's to finally get serious about devoting yourself to the people around you. We can help you with that. Small groups are a great way to be involved more intimately in people's lives, and we have some help. If you want to be involved in something like that, please come and talk to me. We become and build this community, the one that we all need and the one that God designed us for, when we commit to loving one another, not just attending things with one another. Our love, this love that we need to pursue, it first of all comes from God. And when we show this Jesus-style love to one another, we extend our interactions with each other beyond just the walls of this building, beyond just the meeting times and programs and events that we have. It will be a true devotion for the people around us that will create a community like no other, and a community that will draw people in and glorify God. If you need help with responding to anything that we've been talking about this morning, please feel free to come and talk to me after this. Thank you for your time.